Since February 2nd, Sixth Army, by order of Hitler, was again subordinated to Army Group A. It is interesting what explanation gave on this occasion General Zeitzler Hitler. He wanted to transfer from the composition of this army 2 divisions in the Crimea, which then could already be considered lost. The reassignment of the Sixth Army to Army Group, he justified that he would not receive these 2 divisions from Army Group South. For the command of Army Group South, the transfer of the Sixth Army to some extent relieved the situation. We already had enough worries. Although we lost with this army a reservoir of forces, from which, having permission to timely withdraw this army from the eastern part of the Dnieper Arc and from the Nikopol bridgehead, we could draw reserves. However, this is exactly what Hitler did not allow. Now, under the onslaught of the enemy, he was forced to give up these areas. January 31st began a new powerful enemy attacks on the northern section of the Sixth Army east of Krivoy Rog, as well as from the south on the Nikopol bridgehead. They led to the enemy's inclination in the latter direction. After 3 days of fighting, the enemy managed to realize a breakthrough with large forces and in the northern section of the Sixth Army. Here suffered heavy losses of the 30th Army, against which operated 12 SD and 2 TK, although the ratio of forces by the number of divisions was only 2-1 in favor of the enemy. The first position of the corps was occupied by 6 divisions, and the second position 2 armoured divisions. But these divisions, due to insufficient replenishment of men and equipment, were only battle groups. In both divisions, by that time, there were only 5 serviceable tanks. There must finally come a moment when the brave troops, as a result of continuous overstretching, exhausted their strength. Since at this time the Sixth Army had already left the subordination of Army Group South, I cannot dwell on the further development of events in this area. In any case, it is clear that with the breakthrough of the enemy on the northern flank of the Sixth Army, both corps that were on this flank, as well as both corps that were operating on the Nikopol bridgehead, were almost surrounded. This result has long predicted the command of the Army Group. Now Hitler saw that it was necessary to finally agree to give up the eastern part of the Dnieper Arc and Nikopol bridgehead. In heavy fighting, the Sixth Army did manage to release their corps from this loop, suffering, however, heavy losses in equipment. A timely abandonment of this bastion, which could not have been held for long anyway, would not only have allowed the full withdrawal of all units located in it, but also freed up divisions for the much more important northern flank of the Army Group. Instead, the Sixth Army's compounds were used up in the operationally less important area, and it was now doubtful whether the army could long resist the enemy onslaught. Cherkassy Cauldron. On the central section of the front occupied by the Army Group, the motorized units of the 1st Tank Army, after a successful counterattack on the positions of the enemy's 40th Army in the eastern part of the gaping hole in our front, began to make the already described above second strike in its western part. But now the enemy Hydra on the battlefield, just left by our tank divisions, grew new heads. At the end of February, the enemy large forces, which consisted mainly of several tank and mechanized corps, broke through in the northwestern part of the above-mentioned outstanding forward section of the front, which was still ordered to hold the inner flanks of the 1st Tank Army and the 8th Army on the Dnieper above Cherkassy. The enemy troops that had broken through passed between 7 AC and 42 AC far, to the south, as far as the Zvenigorodka area. At the same time, the Russians attacked the east-facing section of the front occupied by the 8th Army in the area southwest of Cherkassy and broke through it, bringing into the battle the 4th Guards and 5th Guards tank armies, which included fresh formations. They managed to advance to the west and to connect with the enemy forces that had broken through the front of the 1st Tank Army from the northwest to Zvenigorodka. Thus, the above-described front protrusion, resting in the north in the Dnieper, in which operated 42 AC of the 1st Tank Army, as well as 11 AC of the 8th Army, was cut off. This was the situation that I caught on January 28th on my return to the Army Group. The Group Command immediately took decisive measures to free the encircled corps. The 1st Tank Army was ordered to complete the defeat of the Soviet 1st Tank Army units surrounded on its left flank as soon as possible. 3 TK must be released from this area as soon as possible, together with 16 17 TD, Life Standard and Regiment of heavy tanks under the command of Wake, especially distinguished in the last battle. It had to be transferred to the area where the crisis was now outlined, one tank division at the first opportunity should follow them. Before the 8th Army was tasked to remove from the area occupied by it 3 TD-47 TK and concentrate it at the site of the breakthrough, from the 6th Army was ordered to allocate to reinforce this grouping of another 24 TDN. However, when the latter arrived there, Hitler ordered to return it to Army Group A, as the situation at the Nikopol bridgehead was becoming threatening. She approached there, however, too late. By order of the Army Group Command, both corps were to strike the enemy forces, encircled 42 and 11 AC, in the flank and rear the corps of the 1st Tank Army from the west, the corps of the 8th Army from the south. The Army Group Command concentrated a relatively large number of divisions to unblock the encircled corps. This was necessary because the enemy threw in this area from the northwestern and eastern directions no more and no less than 26 rifle divisions and 7 or 8 tank, mechanized and cavalry corps. The use of such a large number of divisions is due to the fact that, with the exception of fresh and replenished formations, the Soviet divisions were incomplete. The task of our 2 strike groups was to cut the rear communications of the large number of compounds accumulated here and then destroy them with concentric attacks. Unfortunately, at first deep snow, and then the onset of bad weather significantly delayed the concentration of both strike groups. Nevertheless, they managed to strike, as a result of which a significant part of the forces that had surrounded the Cherkassy grouping was defeated. Over 700 tanks, over 600 anti-tank guns, and about 150 guns were destroyed, but both corps captured only 2,000 prisoners. This was a sign that the enemy formations were largely composed of motorized units. Eventually, the impenetrable mud and snow forced us to halt. Strike Wedge 3 TK approached 13 km to the southwestern side of the Cauldron. 47 TK managed to pull back a significant part of the enemy forces. Task Force headquarters left in our headquarters train to Uman to ensure the interaction of both armies in these battles. The headquarters of the 1st Tank Army was located in Uman. The headquarters of the 8th Army was also not far from there. Twice I tried to get from Uman to the strike groups. Both times, however, my passenger car got hopelessly stuck in snow or mud. Every day the weather changed, snowstorms interspersed with thaw. At the same time, it was again confirmed that Soviet tanks, when advancing on snow or wet soil, are superior to our tanks in their cross-country ability, because they have wider tracks. Since there was no more hope that our tanks would reach the Cauldron, I ordered both encircled corps to break through to the southwest. During this time, as a result of renewed enemy attacks from all sides, both corps crowded into a small space extending in the direction from north to south for 45 km and from west to east only 15 to 20 km. Thus it was necessary to act if we wanted to still save these corps. On the 4th of February, the Soviets had already demanded their surrender. On the night of February 16th to 17th, both corps under the leadership of their commanders, Stemmermann and Lieb, made an attempt to break out of the encirclement in a southwestern direction, to meet 3 TK, which was straining every effort to, despite the impenetrable mud, to throw at least a few tanks towards the breakthrough group. According to the order of the Army Group Command, both encircled corps had to use all artillery and available ammunition to ensure the exit from the encirclement. Since the troops would have to move through off-road terrain and deep mud while breaking out of the encirclement, it was ordered the guns be abandoned after all ammunition had been expended. Rear guards with a few guns covered the troops coming out of the encirclement from enemy attacks from the north, east and south. One can imagine with what feelings, hoping and worrying, we waited in our headquarters train for news about whether the withdrawal from the encirclement was successful. On the night of February 16th to 17th at 1:25 a.m. came the joyful news that the first connection between the corps leaving the encirclement and the advanced units of 3 TK had been established. The enemy, who was between them, was literally crushed. February 28th, we learned that the boiler came out of the 300000 to 32,000 people. As it contained 6 divisions and 1 brigade, this amounted to a large proportion of the active bayonets when the low troop strength was taken into account. It caused us great pain that most of the seriously wounded who came out of the encirclement could not take with them. General Stemmermann died during the battle. Thus we were able to save these two corps from the fate that befell the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Hitler, and here Hitler first gave the order to continue the fight in the Cauldron, but then retroactively approved the order of the army group to prepare for the exit from the encirclement. The order to withdraw from the encirclement was given by the command of the group without prior agreement with Hitler in order to eliminate the possibility of objections on his part. Of course, when leaving the encirclement, most of the heavy weapons and guns were stuck in the mud. Only a few of them, at the cost of incredible efforts, troops managed to take with them. The divisions that escaped from the Cauldron had to be temporarily withdrawn to the rear. As a consequence, 6.5 divisions of the army group did not take part in the fighting, which further complicated the situation. However, this could not overshadow the joy that brought us a successful rescue, at least the personnel of both corps. For the 1st Tank Army and the 8th Army now remained the task to again establish a strong connection between their sections and at the first opportunity to allocate tank units in reserve. After I visited the divisions that had left the encirclement, the task force of the headquarters returned to Proskurov. This was required by the situation on the left flank of the army group. Rovno. For the reasons stated above, the command of the group during February made every effort to prevent the final breakthrough of the enemy in the central section of its front. Thus it prevented the threat of encirclement of the right flank of the army group still in the Dnieper arc. Then there was an urgent need to free the corps surrounded near Cherkassy. After this was accomplished, all our thoughts returned to the situation on the northern flank of the army group. Here the 4th Tank Army occupied at that time even more or less continuous front facing northeast, from the area northeast of Vinnytsia to a point west of the small town of Shepetovka, located about 75 kilometers strictly north of Proskurov, where the headquarters of our army group. At Shepetovka, the continuous front of the army ended. On a front about 240 km wide, there were at that time only 9 weak, but still capable divisions, united by 3 corps headquarters. The enemy somewhat weakened his attacks on the section of this army, as he was obviously forced to give respite to his troops. Despite this, it was clear that the army is unlikely to be able to the above-mentioned forces to repel the advance of superior enemy forces. Much more dangerous for the situation created on the front of the army group was obviously another threat. In front of the western flank of the 4th Tank Army, far to the north, up to the southern boundary line with Army Group Centre, now stretched open space, in which there were almost no German troops. The enemy sooner or later could begin from this area deep bypass of the 4th Panzer Army, and thus the entire army group. If the northern part of this large empty space, the Pinsk marshes, could not be used for major operations, it should have been taken into account that immediately north of the section of the 4th Panzer Army, from east to west, stretched an isthmus about 60 km wide, through which ran a wide highway from Kiev through Zhytomyr to Rivne and further west into the Governor-General's office to Lemberg and Lublin. In order to cut this isthmus, and thus the aforementioned highway, the group's command moved 13 AC to the tip of its northern flank. Its commander was my former Chief of Staff in 38 AC, General Golfer, who was characterized by very energetic actions. Unfortunately, in March 1944, Golfer died at his post. With small forces at his disposal, during February and March he held off the advance of superior enemy forces on both sides of the aforementioned Great Highway, skillfully evading repeated attempts by the enemy to encircle his corps. Farther north, already in the area of the Pinsk marshes east of Kovel, several police units guarded a large railroad line leading from Kiev to Poland. In view of the superiority of the enemy forces, the isolated 13th AK, of course, could only temporarily delay the enemy's advance, but not stop it. Already in early February, the city of Rivne was surrendered. The 13th Army was forced to withdraw westward to Dubno. The Reichskommissar of the Ukraine, Garlaita Koch, whose residence was in Rovno, of course, got out of there in advance, remembering to give his subordinate authorities and police units orders to hold out to the end. In East Prussia later he also managed to get away. Hitler, however, demanded the head of the general responsible for the surrender of the city. As Zeitzler informed me, Keitel sought even shot on the spot commandant of Rovno. When Zeitzler began to strongly object to this, and said that Hitler would certainly want to first listen to his generals, Göring intervened. He said, No, that is out of the question. Where will it take us if we do this every time? After all, this is not at all part of the function of the head of state. Not to say that this case did not concern Goering at all. He was certainly the last person who had the right to send others to their deaths allegedly for breach of duty. His words once again showed that he harboured a hatred for generals, for the army in general. Hitler, however, did not follow the advice of Keitel and Goering, but ordered a judicial investigation. As a result of the trial, was sentenced to death not the accused, the commandant of Rivne, and summoned to the court as a witness, the commander of the division operating near Rivne. This sentence, however, was overturned by Hitler on my petition, joined by the army commander, due to the fact that the reasons for the surrender of the city should be sought in the prevailing situation in the area. At the time when I was commander of the army group, there were no flying field courts martial yet. Let us now return to the situation at the front of the 4th Tank Army. Although at that time, as mentioned above, this army was not yet in immediate danger, it was clear that in the area to the north of it, guarded by only weak forces, the enemy offensive would soon unfold. It could be conducted in a westerly direction to Lemberg or in a southerly direction, bypassing the western flank of the 4th Tank Army. The reader will recall that the Army Group Command, anticipating this danger, repeatedly demanded that in the area of Rovno was concentrated another army. This was not done. The General Command did not release for this forces in another area. It also did not give the Army Group permission to freedom of operational manoeuvre of its southern flank, which would have given the opportunity to release forces. It goes without saying that the command of the group, after the end of fighting in the Cherkassy Cauldron, transferred a large number of tanks from the central section of the front to the left flank. They could be concentrated in this area by March 15th. However, as the group headquarters wrote to the OK, at best this would have been sufficient only to prevent deep coverage of the western flank of this army. Still, the decisive battle was expected on the left flank of the army group. Therefore, it was necessary to strengthen it through the transfer of new formations. However, the General Command did not take any decisive action in this regard. Obviously, Hitler counted on the fact that the offensive impulse of the Soviet troops is already exhausted. In addition, he expected the imminent onset of thaw, which should have prevented the Soviets from undertaking major operations. Although our offensive to relieve the encircled grouping at Cherkassy in mid-February was halted by snowstorms interspersed with thaw, the period of the real thaw was still far away. The question of whether the offensive impulse of the enemy was exhausted should have been considered, not forgetting the heavy losses of our troops. The Army Group headquarters cited in a report sent to the OKH to cover these two related issues a number of figures that allowed to create a clear picture of the losses of both sides and the arrival of replenishment. On the basis of numerous testimonies of prisoners, we calculated that the enemy units operating in front of our front in the period from July 1943 to January 1944 received about 10800 replenishments. This roughly corresponded to the losses that the enemy suffered during this period. The losses of the Army Group during the same period amounted to 405,409 men killed, wounded and missing. Replenishments we received only in the amount of 221893 men. Thus, if the enemy compounds and suffered significantly higher losses than we did, if the combat qualities of the enemy infantry were deteriorating, the figures showed that the balance of forces has changed far from in our favour. In addition to inflicted by us to the enemy heavy losses killed, we would have to capture also a large number of prisoners, but this was only possible with the manoeuvring nature of the fighting. In the tank formations, the situation at the present time was such that the Soviet tank corps participating in the operations only in one case had 20 tanks, on average 50 to 100 tanks, with the staff of 200 to 200 to 250 tanks. Our tank divisions, in contrast to them, had on average, at best, a little more than 30 serviceable tanks. Only in the tank divisions recently handed over to us the situation was somewhat better, but in some divisions the situation was even worse. In total, the enemy in front of our front in the above period received about 2,700 new tanks, we only 872. At the same time, we do not take into account the large number of compounds that the enemy held in reserve. Of interest may also be the following data characterizing the combat actions of individual armies that were part of our group. Of course, in some cases there could be errors caused by double counting, for example, of tanks hit. According to these reports, the enemy lost in January 17,653 prisoners, 2873 tanks, 588 guns, 2481 anti-tank guns; in February 7,700 prisoners, 1,055 tanks, 200 guns, 885 anti-tank guns. These figures show how well the Soviet army was already at that time equipped with equipment. The Soviets were no longer forced to throw huge masses of men into battle. At the same time, however, the figures indicate a large difference between the number of prisoners captured and the amount of equipment captured and destroyed. Either it was the fact that the Soviets were often able to avoid capture if they left their heavy weapons behind, or they suffered extremely high losses in men. As to Hitler's position in the light of the data given on the question of the further course of operations, and thus on the threat that might arise on the northern flank of Army Group, it is very characteristic of the conversation which I had by telephone with General Zeitzler on February 18th. I pointed out the danger which might loom over the northern flank of the Army Group. In doing so, I dwelt on the balance of forces on both sides, and also pointed out that it was still unfavourable for us in comparison with the other army groups. Below I give a transcript of this conversation, produced by a staff officer. Zeitzler, I had a long conversation with the Führer on this subject, and also on the measures necessary in connection with it, but again I achieved nothing. Me? How does he think to conduct further operations on our front? Zeitzler, he says that someday the Russians will stop advancing. Since July of last year they have been on the offensive continuously. It can't go on much longer. I said to him in reply to this, my Führer, if you were in the position of the Russians now, what would you do? He replied, nothing. I objected. I would launch an offensive, and precisely on Lvov. Hitler, however, as before, counted on the fact that the exhaustion of forces and weather would force the enemy to stop his offensive operations in the near future. In May he would then be able, as he told me at one time, to dispose of newly formed divisions. If Hitler would have transferred the personnel and equipment intended for them to our battle-tested divisions, the situation would obviously be different. The hour had come. In March 1944, the hour came when we had to pay for the great mistake that the German High Command had made, which was that it did not want to give up anything when it was necessary to achieve superiority in a decisive area, or at least to concentrate enough forces on it. In the first place, it had to pay for the fact that in 1944 it had not thrown all its energies into achieving decisive success in the East, and had not achieved here at least a draw in the war, or the depletion of the Soviet strike force, until a real second front had emerged in the West. The mistake was, furthermore, that since the failure of the last German offensive, Operation Citadel, the High Command had tried to hold the overextended fronts with insufficient forces, which had caused an entirely unnecessary expenditure of forces. Finally, the High Command was wrong to require that the southern flank of the Eastern Front was chained to the defence of the far eastward protrusions of the front, first in the Donetsk region and the Kuban, then in the Dnieper Arc and in the Crimea, as a result of which the enemy was able to cut off the groups occupying them. At the same time, it overlooked that the outcome of the campaign will be decided not on these protrusions, but where the enemy will be able to throw the entire German southern flank to the south, to the Black Sea and Romania. This decisive section of the front, since Operation Citadel, had always been the northern flank of Army Group South. Now it was too late. The decisive year of 1944 had expired, and in the East it was not possible to achieve even a draw in the outcome of hostilities. Whether this would be possible in the future depended on the outcome of the expected invasion in the West in 1944. On the southern section of the Eastern Front, however, it was now necessary to pay for these mistakes. The hope that Hitler had expressed at the end of February, that the exhaustion of forces and the onset of the thaw would lead to the cessation of the enemy offensive, was, at least, premature. Of course, the Russians had to pay with huge losses for their successes, gained in heavy fighting with bravely held German troops. It was also clear that the combat effectiveness of infantry formations, in which they have driven in their newly captured areas of all men without exception, capable of bearing arms, is constantly decreasing. But the enemy, after all, still had fresh or replenished formations. Although the number of tanks in his tank mechanized corps, due to the heavy losses mentioned above, had decreased, it was many times the number of tanks in the German divisions. On the German side, in counterbalance to this, even a thorough combing of all rear units could not compensate for the lack of replenishment. We had already enlisted hundreds of thousands of volunteers in the wagons and transport units. These were Russian volunteers, mainly from the Ukraine and the Caucasus, who served us honestly, faithfully and willingly. They preferred service in the German army to returning to Bolshevik domination. The Rasputitsa began at the beginning of March, although it was interrupted sometimes by the onset of frost. It was, however, at first much more unfavourable for us than for the Russians. I have already mentioned that the Russian tanks, due to their wide tracks, were superior to our tanks in manoeuvrability in the snow and during the thaw. At the same time, a large number of American trucks appeared on the enemy's side. They could drive over rough terrain, without roads, while our vehicles during this period were tied to paved roads. In view of this, the enemy was able to quickly move infantry from his tank and mechanized corps. In addition, on our side, with the increasing thaw, more and more tractors were out of service. As a result, our mobile formations could move long distances only with a great loss of time, and when they collided with the enemy, the latter had a great advantage. Army Group Command continued to attach great importance to the strengthening of its northern flank until the thaw temporarily forces the enemy to stop the offensive, and for the period when the fighting resumes again. The enemy will certainly continue to further offensive on the front of Army Group A and our 8th Army. He still had before him the prospect of breaking this far advanced flank, to push it back to the Black Sea, or, in any case, to seize the crossings across the Bug and later across the Dnieper. After all, here he was attracted by the goal of recapturing Bessarabia and clear the way to Romania and further into the Balkans. These countries Roosevelt obviously very much wanted to leave behind Uncle Joe. Nevertheless, we had on this flank the opportunity, if necessary, to apply elastic defence, and thus, due to the resulting significant reduction of the front of the 6th Army, to free up large forces. It was possible behind the lower reaches of the Bug, or the Dnieper, taking large forces positions for a decisive resistance to force the enemy to stop. When, therefore, already on February 22nd marked a new offensive of the enemy on the southern flank of the 8th Army, the command of the group demanded that he was given the freedom of manoeuvre for withdrawal. We did not intend to and could not transfer here new forces, which in other areas were much more necessary. The prerequisite for the withdrawal of the 8th Army was, however, to join this manoeuvre adjacent to us from the south of the 6th Army, moved further to the east. In this regard, the Army Group Command requested approval from the OK. Predictably, Hitler did not give it. On the contrary, the Army Group was subsequently forced to transfer 2 more divisions to the 6th Army when its too far forward forces were defeated by the enemy. Much greater operational chances would have opened before the enemy if he did not move along the Black Sea coast, striking Army Group A, and would begin to achieve decisive success on the northern flank of Army Group South. If at the same time he would be able to introduce large forces into the battle, perhaps even before the onset of thaw, to make a breakthrough north facing front of the 4th Panzer Army, in his hands would be so important for the supply of the entire southern flank of the railroad going from Lemberg through Zhemarinka in southern Ukraine. In the future, continuing to advance southward, the enemy would go to the flank and rear of the southern wing of the Eastern Front. In addition, it was safe to assume that the enemy would use the large unprotected space formed between the northern flank of Army Group South and the southern flank of Army Group Centre to concentrate a new strong strike group in front of him. Its task would be a deep bypass of the left flank of the Army Group, or Hitler-Zeitzler specified strike on Lemberg. Data on the appearance in this area of the First Belarusian Front, received in late February, clearly indicated these intentions. As a result of such a withdrawal of its left flank, Army Group would inevitably be forced to retreat to the south, perhaps even east of the Carpathians. The Soviets would have been opened a way through Lemberg into Galicia, or even into Poland proper. Such a course of events had to be prevented at all costs. As soon as the battles for the liberation of the troops encircled near Cherkassy were over, and after that the connection between the sections of the front occupied by the 1st Tank Army and the 8th Army was established, The Army Group Command gave the order to transfer large forces to the left flank. From the composition of 1 tank and 8 armies were allocated for the transfer of 11 TD and 16 TD from 3 TK. They were soon to be followed for concentration in the area of Proskurov behind the 4th Tank Army 17 TD and Artillery Division. By the same armies were allocated to the 4th Tank Army 7 TD, Lifeguard and 503 Battalion of Heavy Tanks. These compounds were to be part of the 48 TK and concentrated in the Ternopil area. While 3 TK was assigned the task of preventing a breakthrough or stopping enemy units breaking through the front north of Proskurov, the task of 48 TK was to prevent the enemy forces striking at Ternopil from covering the western flank of our troops. 3 infantry divisions promised by OK were also sent to the disposal of the 4th Tank Army. For the transfer of these divisions from the areas occupied by other armies, of course, needed time. In addition, roads and transportation capabilities did not allow to make this transfer in a short period of time. Therefore, they could not arrive before mid-March in their intended areas behind the left flank of the Army Group. In early March, the Army Group Command ordered a significant expansion and relocation of the strips occupied by the armies towards the left flank. Thus, the command of the 4th Tank Army was able to direct the actions of troops in the area of Ternopil-Dubno, which now became especially important. The 4th Tank Army handed over to the 1st Tank Army a section of the front ending near Shepetivka and took the section east of the line Ternopil-Dubno. There were only 48 TK formed here, 13 artillery corps operating in the Dubno area, as well as a police group in the Kovel area. The 1st Tank Army transferred its front north of Uman to the 8th Army. The right flank corps of the 8th Army, in turn, was transferred to the 6th Army by order of the OK. In early March, the Army Group headquarters first moved to Kamianets-Podolsky and then to Lemberg to be behind its left flank. On the Romanian territory, on which in our opinion could be located our headquarters, just behind the central area occupied by the army groups, on Hitler's instructions we were not allowed to move. It was still unclear whether all the measures described above would be sufficient to stop the enemy offensive, which could unfold even before the onset of thawing. In any case, for the period following the thaw, it was necessary, as the Army Group Command repeatedly emphasized in its appeals to the OK, to send 2 armies with a total of 15 to 20 divisions to the Lemberg area. Only in this case it would be possible to prevent the expected bypass of the enemy left flank of the Army Group with its already described consequences. It is quite clear that the removal of forces on such a large scale from the sites of the 8th and 1st Panzer armies posed a great risk to them. The enemy, as far as the terrain and weather would allow him, would continue to attack on their front with the aim of breaking through in the direction of the middle course of the Bug and the crossings from Vinica to Voznice. However, the command of the group in this situation had to choose the lesser of 2 evils. Such a lesser evil was, of course, giving the enemy the opportunity to advance on the left flank of the 1st Tank Army and on the section of the 8th Army. The operational consequences of such an advance could have been avoided by the withdrawal of our neighbour to the south, the 6th Army southward, over the Bug, or in the worst case over the Dnieper. In the case of a decisive success of the enemy on the left flank of the Army Group, its consequences from the operational point of view could not be avoided. To prevent the Russians to go deep into the flank of Army Groups South and A. Or to Lemberg, this was the operational goal, which set before the Army Group for the period before the onset of the full thaw. At the same time, it was necessary to accept the possibility of further withdrawal of our right flank, and thus Army Group A to the west. Although the state of the weather did not give our aerial reconnaissance ability to determine whether the enemy has undertaken a regrouping of its forces, and where he concentrates them, the Army Group Command assessed the situation as follows. The 1st Belarusian Front, which appeared for the first time in front of our front, will obviously concentrate its forces to bypass the western flank of the Army Group in the area of Rivne. The 1st Ukrainian Front will strike at the north-facing section on both sides of Proskurov, now withdrawn to the 1st Tank Army. The 2nd Ukrainian Front, as we had supposed, will resume strikes on the right flank of the 1st Tank Army and in the band of the 8th Army, and, if it succeeds in forcing the Bug, will continue the offensive on Sienowitz. The 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts would continue to attempt to succeed on the right flank of the 8th Army and in the 6th Army's section. On March 3rd, the offensive began on the left flank of the Army Group, on the sections of the 4th and 1st Panzer Armies. The enemy large forces, including a tank corps, attacked the 13th Artillery Corps, located near Dubno, and tried to encircle it. The main blow was made by the forces of 2 tank armies and the 60th Army, with the aim to break the front in the southern direction on the section Proskorov-Ternopil. Apparently, the enemy set himself the task to cut the most important communication of the Army Group in order to reach the Dniester River, weather permitting. At the same time, the enemy's 18th Army was trying to push back the right flank of the 1st Tank Army to the southeast. The following comparative data gives an idea of the grouping of forces of both sides for this period. As a result of moving the dividing lines between the armies within the Army Group to the west in early March, the 8th Army received from the 1st Tank Army 3 infantry divisions on a front 60 km wide. The 1st Tank Army received from the 4th Tank Army 5 infantry divisions and 3.5 armoured and motorised divisions on a front 200 km wide. Enemy forces. Our forces. Width. Front enemy in front of the 6th Army front 62 rifle divisions, 3 tank and mechanised corps, 1 cavalry corps, 1 tank corps, approximately 18 infantry divisions, 3 tank divisions enemy in front of the 8th Army front 57 rifle divisions, 11 tank and mechanised corps 5 infantry divisions, 4 tank and motorised divisions 135 km enemy in front of the 1st Tank Army front 37 to 40 rifle divisions, 11 tank and mechanised corps 8 infantry divisions, 1 artillery division, 1 tank division 180 km enemy in front of the 4th Tank Army 18 rifle divisions, 5 armoured and mechanised corps, 1 cavalry corps 8 infantry divisions, 1 guard division, 1 police unit, 9.5 armoured and motorised divisions 510 km. When I visited the front line at Shepetovka on March 4th, the situation of the 59th Artillery Corps operating there was already quite serious. On its right and left the enemy had broken through our front. It was preparing to encircle the corps from the west and east. To eliminate this danger it had to be withdrawn. Thanks to the confident and calm actions of the corps commander, General Schultz, my former chief of staff in the Crimea, as well as the approach of the newly arrived 1TD, this withdrawal was realised. The enemy, however, continued to try to achieve the encirclement of the corps by a parallel pursuit in the direction of Proskorov. Both tank corps ports concentrated on this flank of the Army Group were put into action. 3 TK was thrown from Proskorov to the northwest in order to strike at the enemy advancing at the junction between the 1st and 4th Tank Armies. 48 TK had the task to start an offensive against enemy tanks, which were striking at Ternopil and east of it in the southern direction. In general, by March 7th the enemy, by March 7th, put into battle in the area of 25 infantry divisions and 7 tank corps. In early March, the enemy then undertook an offensive on the left flank of the 8th Army. Within 2 weeks, he managed to make up for the losses he suffered during the strike of our tank corps in unblocking the German group encircled southwest of Cherkassy. As soon as we withdrew from this area tank corps to move them behind the left flank of the Army Group, the enemy began an offensive in the direction of Uman. In the breakthrough in this area, he introduced at least 20 infantry divisions and 4 tank corps. He managed to break 7 AC and on March 9th to approach Uman. On the site of Army Group, the enemy resumed attacks and broke through the front in the direction of Nikolaev at the mouth of the Bug. On March 7th, the command of the group reported to the Oak situation and conveyed that he has nothing left but to try to withstand this onslaught, until, finally, the thaw will not prevent the enemy to continue the offensive. From the point of view of the further development of events, however, it is decisive to ensure that at the end of the thaw in the area of Ternopil-Lutsk-Lemberg were transferred forces that could prevent the enemy breakthrough to Lemberg-Lublin, or to strike the advancing enemy in the flank, if he tries to advance on Ternopil from the south. At that time it was important for the Army Group to buy time and, if possible, to preserve the combat effectiveness of its troops, even at the cost of abandoning new territories, until the thaw forced the enemy to stop his attacks. Unfortunately, until that moment was still to pass a lot of time. At this time, Hitler thought he had found a new means of stopping the enemy's advance. Settlements that were of tactical importance as communication nodes or for other reasons, he declared fortresses. In them he appointed fortress commandants, who were responsible for the defense of the fortress on their honor and in case of its fall paid for it with their heads. The armies in whose bands these fortresses, declared by Hitler personally, were located had to ensure their timely supply and formation of garrisons. Hitler thought that these settlements, due to the fact that they blocked the way to important roads or frontiers, or due to the fact that the possession of such fortresses would attract the enemy, would delay his advance. From the very beginning, however, it was clear that this invention of Hitler on a large scale cannot lead to success. In practice, it turned out that for the defense of these cities allocated more troops than it was appropriate for their retention. Needless to say, these forces had nowhere to go. Fortresses without fortifications with a hastily assembled weak garrison sooner or later fell into enemy hands, not fulfilling the role assigned to them. Therefore, the army group command in each individual case demanded and finally achieved that these fortresses were abandoned before their encirclement by the enemy became inevitable. Only with regard to Ternopil it could not be done in due time. Here only the remnants of the garrison managed to escape from the encirclement. Unfortunately, this action of Hitler later, in 1944, led to heavy losses. In order to fight to gain time and save the army from encirclement, Army Group had to, after the breakthrough of the enemy on the left flank of the 8th Army on March 11th, to withdraw the 8th Army, and 2 days later, and the right flank of the 1st Panzer Army over the Bug. On the left flank of the 1st Tank Army, before 3 TK1 Tank Army was tasked to continue the battle in the area of Proskurov, so that as soon as possible to restore communication with the 4th Tank Army and to facilitate the situation on its right flank. The task of the 4th Tank Army was to prevent enemy tanks from breaking through east of Ternopil to the south in the direction of the Dniester River, and thus prevent the 1st Tank Army from being pushed back to the southeast. By putting into action the divisions already mentioned, which were to be sent by the OK, at the same time the communication along the line Lemberg-Ternopil-Proskurov was to be restored again. For the certainly necessary reinforcement of forces in the area extending to the north, in which the 13th Artillery Corps was operating, the Army Group had no means at its disposal at that time. The situation continued to change faster and faster. By March 15th, the enemy was able to strike hard at the left flank of the 8th Army. Between this army and the 1st Tank Army there was a wide gap from Uman to Vinitsa. The enemy, moving further to the southwest, advanced behind the Bug River. On the site of the 8th Army advanced detachments of 5 armies, including 1 Tank Army. Although the 8th Army threw all the forces it had been able to release on its right flank onto its left flank to attack the enemy forces that had crossed the Bug, it was clear that it would only be able to stop them in some sections, but would not be able to hold on the broad front of the Bug and re-establish contact with the 1st Tank Army. Moreover, if it had tried to do so, the large enemy forces that had forced the Bug would have pushed back the 8th Army to the south, and, by carrying out a parallel pursuit, would have been the first to reach the Dniester. The enemy also managed to break through on the right flank of the 1st Tank Army and, advancing south of Vinitsa, to reach the Bug. This city was immediately declared a fortress by Hitler. However, it was clear from the beginning that it would be impossible to hold it for a long time because it would require 3 divisions. Where were we to get them? On the left flank of the army to the west of Proskurov, the 3rd Guards Tank Army, consisting of 3 tank corps, was covering our forces. On the section of the 4th Tank Army, thanks to the successful offensive of the infantry divisions sent by the OK, temporarily managed to restore the situation in the area of Ternopil. However, the 13th Artillery Corps, was withdrawing to Brody, was under the threat of encirclement. The general situation showed that it was no longer possible to return on the right flank of the Army Group Bug line and hold it. Already on March 16th it became clear that the enemy, who had forced the river, began an offensive with the forces of 1 Tank Army westward toward the nearest crossings across the Dniester. 2 more armies and 1 Tank Army turned south towards the northern flank of the 8th Army. At the same time, the 1st Tank Army was threatened by both flanks. Despite the success at Ternopil, it was doubtful whether the 4th Panzer Army would be able to hold off the enemy's advance in the direction of Lemberg for a long time or prevent him from striking in a southerly direction. How could it be that the enemy was able to succeed so quickly? After all, until now it had always been possible to regulate the pace of withdrawal when it became necessary, as well as to stop the enemy broke through or to prevent him from entering the operational space, at least to limit the further development of his operations. In addition to the overwhelming superiority of enemy forces, the reason for this was, of course, the final exhaustion of our troops. German divisions in continuous fighting since mid-July were literally ground to a pulp. The numerical composition of the regiments reached only a small part of its original value. The remaining forces were also exhausted due to the constant overstretching of forces. The very small reinforcements sent to us, who had no military experience, could not compensate for the loss of experienced non-commissioned officers and soldiers. How could we make effective counterattacks if, for example, in the entire tank corps had only 24 serviceable tanks? Despite this, the troops performed amazing feats. Where it was possible to gather around experienced, brave soldiers and officers any significant group, it was able to repel the attacks of superior enemy forces. In general, however, there were simply not enough men and equipment to defend large areas in which often many times outnumbered enemy managed to find a gap to strike. At any rate, the troops were not to blame for the rapid pace of the enemy's advance. The fact that in very rare cases there were manifestations of cowardice in the current situation is not surprising. If all of the above applies to the entire area of the army group, it is still necessary to explain why it was on its right flank, in the band of the 8th Army and the right flank of the 1st Tank Army, there was such a sharp deterioration of the situation. The command of both armies in this was not guilty. Such a development of events should be explained by the fact that on this flank of the army group lacked those 6.5 divisions, which after their release from the Cherkassy Cauldron were withdrawn to replenish the Governor-General's office. They were now nothing to replace them. In addition, the Army Group Command, as indicated earlier, took from these armies 2 tank corps with 6 armoured divisions to use them on the left flank of the Army Group. If these forces had been left in place, the situation on the front of both armies, of course, would have developed much better. Thus, the Group Command is certainly responsible for the events on its right flank. But how would the overall situation on the front of the Army Group, and thus on the entire southern flank of the Eastern Front, if the 2 corps were not transferred in time to the left flank of the Army Group? Certainly, in this case, by the beginning of March 1944, the northern flank of the Army Group would have been finally broken, and its remnants east of the Carpathians would have been thrown back to the south. Thus, the encirclement of the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front, or its withdrawal to the Balkans, could not be prevented. In this tense situation, I was summoned to Obersalzberg. A few days before, the adjutant of the armed forces under Hitler, General Schmund, had come to see me. He offered me to sign a rather strange document. It was a kind of pledge of loyalty of all field marshals, addressed to Hitler, in connection with the propaganda deployed by General von Seydlitz, who was captured at Stalingrad. The idea for this document was apparently Schmund's, who thereby wanted to strengthen Hitler's faith in the army. Apparently, Hitler approved of this initiative and even very much welcomed it. Since all field marshals except me had already signed this document, I had no choice but to do the same. If I had refused, it would have meant that I sympathized with von Seydlitz's propaganda. Nevertheless, I told Schmund that as a soldier I considered such a step unnecessary. That German soldiers would not listen to the propaganda of the Free Germany Committee was self-evident to me. Confirmation that we would fulfill our soldierly duty was, in my opinion, unnecessary. However, the leaflets of the committee that were dropped over the Cherkassy Cauldron did not reach their target, nor did the letter sent by General von Seydlitz to General Lieb, who was in the Cauldron. Such a letter also came to my desk at that time. It seemed genuine. A Ukrainian partisan found this letter and gave it to us. The statement referred to above was delivered to Hitler on March 19th by Field Marshal von Rundstedt in the presence of many top officers of all branches of the armed forces. This act apparently made a great impression on Hitler. This call for an expression of loyalty, together with Hitler's disagreement with my suggestions, which I had so often made to him, and his refusal to recognize what was an absolute necessity, demand an answer to the question why I nevertheless remained in my post. In putting the question in this general form, I can only say that I, who had been at the front for many years now, where I had had to deal with such heavy tasks, was not then able to see that the regime prevailing in the country was degenerating. I also could not at that time to understand what Hitler really represents, to see what we take for granted today. The rumours spreading in the rear hardly penetrated to the front, least of all to us. The preoccupations and tasks that the war brought with it left us almost no time to think about general questions. In this respect, we were in a completely different position from military or political figures on the home front or in occupied areas where no hostilities were taking place. As far as military matters were concerned, of course, I could not fail to see the errors in the leadership of the military actions made by Hitler. Why I did not consider it possible to eliminate him by force during the war, I have already said before. As for me personally and the question of staying in my post, I often enough had the desire to leave it. Often, when Hitler did not agree with my proposals or tried to interfere in the affairs of the command of the army group, I asked the Chief of the General Staff to tell Hitler to look for another commander. What, however, always persuaded me, along with the requests of my closest associates, not to leave my post, cannot simply be characterized by the hackneyed words I wanted to prevent the worst. Rather, it was the conviction that perhaps no headquarters would be able to cope with the tasks of managing the troops on our decisive section of the front as ours, which had undergone years of heavy fighting. My departure would mean not just a change of commander, but much more. I was guided by a sense of duty to the troops subordinate to me, who in turn had confidence in their commander. I could not leave them to their fate. Only imminent death, which would threaten my troops, could force me to submit my resignation as a last resort in order to get from Hitler the most necessary. Such an occasion was soon to present itself in connection with the decision of the question of the death or salvation of the 1st Tank Army. The above-described act at Obersalzberg gave me the opportunity to make Hitler, in connection with the continuously deteriorating situation, the following proposals. Immediate withdrawal of the 6th Army behind the Dniester. It was still in a prominent far eastward bulge of the front, on the lower reaches of the Bug, which required too much force. The same proposal was made by the commander of Army Group A, Field Marshal von Kleist himself. Rapid manoeuvring of large forces, which would thus be released from the 6th Army, northward to the area between the Dniester and Prut in order to prevent the departure of the 8th Army from the Dniester to the southeast. A clear decision that the task of Army Group A, together with the Romanian Army, is now to defend the borders of Romania, whether on the Dniester or on the Prut. Immediate reinforcement of the northern flank of Army Group South in order to prevent its withdrawal to the Carpathians, as well as the breakthrough of the enemy at Lemberg. I added that in this solution of the question we'll first have to reconcile with the fact that between Army Group A and Army Group South will initially remain a gap. Without this cannot create a reliable front line north of the Carpathians. If the enemy later tries to advance through this gap in the direction of Hungary further into the Balkans, it will be possible to strike him from the north in the rear, as soon as reinforcements arrive, which Hitler promised to give in May. Hitler, however, was unwilling to accept such a far-reaching operational concept. He decided that Army Group A should remain on the Bug, and promised to carry out for the northern flank of Army Group South only a number of small secondary activities. With a detailed analysis of the situation, which I sent on March 22nd to General Zeitzler, I again sent the above proposals. I justified them by the state of the troops and the already existing situation in which it is impossible to restore a continuous front between the 1st Panzer Army and the 8th Army. It is necessary that Army Group A, which should be reassigned to the 8th Army, to cover the approaches to Romania, while Army Group South should prevent the enemy's advance north of the Carpathians to the west. For this purpose, the 4th Panzer Army must necessarily hold the line occupied by it, so its reinforcement is necessary. The 1st Tank Army, first of all, must restore communication with the 4th Tank Army and not let itself be thrown back to the south. Between both groups of armies, passes over the Carpathians should be covered by the Hungarian army. The gaze of the Hungarians, who at one time had entered the war, actually by compulsion, was still directed mainly at Transylvania, which in 1918 had been handed over to Romania. It was known that our allies, both Hungarians and Romanians, looked upon each other with such distrust that they preferred to keep their best units inland in order to have them at hand in case of need. After the defeat at the Don in the winter of 1942/43, both Romanian armies and then the only Hungarian army were withdrawn from the front. Marshal Antonescu, however, again made his forces available to guard the coast of the Sea of Azov. He also left Romanian units in the 17th Army, which had operated first on the Kuban bridgehead and then in the Crimea. He now transferred the new armies to Army Group A to defend the borders of Romania. After withdrawing their army from the front, the Hungarians left several divisions in the Reichskommissariat of Ukraine. However, they were strictly instructed not to participate in hostilities against the Soviets. We had to withdraw the Hungarians back in time as the front approached. Their tasks were limited to guarding the railroads and highways from partisans in the rear areas. Now, however, a critical moment had come for the Hungarians as well. We could not do without a capable Hungarian army in Hungary itself to defend the Carpathians and the area north of them up to the Dniester. But by this time the position of the Hungarian government had become very doubtful. In any case, on March 15th, General Lindemann, sent by the Oak, came to us, bringing with him, in case of treason by the Hungarian government, instructions for the rapid disarmament of the Hungarian forces behind our front. Fortunately, we did not have to fulfill this task. After Regent Horthy's visit to Obersalzberg, the 1st Hungarian Army, consisting of 2 corps, each with over 4 infantry divisions and 1 motorized infantry division, was subordinated to us on March 23rd. However, they had yet to be brought to mobilization readiness. In addition, the armament of the Hungarians was not sufficient and did not meet the requirements for formations fighting Soviet tank forces. In any case, it was hoped that these forces would be able to hold back the Soviet onslaught in the Carpathians. In the mountains, after all, the Russians could use their tanks only to a very limited extent. This hope was supported by memories of how in World War I the Hungarian Gonved had successfully defended the Carpathian passes against the Russians. The prerequisite for this was, of course, the energetic leadership of the troops by the Hungarians. However, the visit of the Hungarian General Lakatos and the commander of the 1st Hungarian Army on March 28th did not leave us with a particularly encouraging impression. Both generals, after listening to our demands, stated that their troops were not yet ready and that they had a shortage of anti-tank equipment. It was clear that some high-ranking Hungarian commanders did not want to vigorously defend the borders of their homeland. What could they expect from the Soviets? Already on the evening of March 19th, I was informed in Obersalzberg that the situation had deteriorated again. It turned out that the 8th Army, in spite of the fact that it had thrown all the forces it had been able to free on its left flank, had not been able to prevent its coverage from the west, as a result of which it had to withdraw southward here. The necessary solution, in this case the transfer to this section of the forces of the 6th Army, which should have been immediately removed from the front occupied by it, was not feasible due to the fact that Hitler still did not give his consent to this. The only thing left was to ask Marshal Antonescu to provide Romanian forces now, and thus extend the front of the 8th Army to the northwest. He himself envisaged to introduce them into the battle only when it became necessary to defend the Prut. Along with the aggravation of the situation on the front of the 8th Army, even more threatening situation arose on the northern flank of the Army Group. The 1st Panzer Army occupied here, after its right flank had failed to gain a foothold on the Bug, a position facing northeast and running from the Dniester approximately to the Zbruch, along which ran the Polish border. To the west of this area, the 4th Tank Army, as mentioned above, managed by counterattacking newly arrived divisions to temporarily restore the position in the area east of Ternopil. On March 20th, however, the enemy, who had concentrated for this purpose 2 tank armies, managed to break through on both sides of the dividing line between the 2 armies to the south in the direction of the upper reaches of the Dniester. On the 23rd of March, the front units of the enemy's 1st Tank Army had already reached the crossing of the Dniester north of Chernivtsi, and units of the 4th Tank Army had reached the crossing south of Kamenets-Podolsky. Thus the enemy came to the rear communications of the 1st Tank Army. As soon as the danger became apparent, the Army Group headquarters ordered the 1st Tank Army to withdraw to a reduced front between the Dniester and Proskurov in order to free up forces to fight for rear communications. At the same time, he also subordinated to the army a battle group from the 4th Tank Army under General Maus, the only island in the area flooded with troops from both enemy tank armies left in the rear of the 1st Tank Army. This group was to try to stop the main enemy forces advancing behind the tanks and cut off the tanks from their rear. However, it was clear that such measures cannot restore the situation on the northern flank of the army group. If so far only enemy tanks had reached the rear communications deep in the rear of the 1st Tank Army, it was possible to foresee that in the near future the army would be completely surrounded. If we still wanted to create north of the Carpathians' strong front line, it was necessary that the 1 Tank Army was immediately removed from the threat of encirclement. Army Group Command sent the OK on March 23rd a request to the OK to urgently transfer our forces in order to dislodge the enemy from the rear area of the 1st Tank Army. On the 24th of March came the answer, which boiled down to the fact that the 1st Panzer Army should continue to hold its extended front, facing east and northeast, to extend it to Ternopil and in addition to knock the enemy out of its rear area. The Group Command reported at noon on March 24th that if by 3 p.m. it did not receive instructions in connection with the request sent to it, it would instead order the 1st Tank Army to break through to the west. At 4 p.m. the decision arrived that the Führer was in general agreement that 1 Panzer Army should break through to the west to establish contact with the rest of the forces. However, he continued to demand that it hold essentially the same section of the front between the Dnieper and Ternopil. It was unclear where the army would get the strength to strike westward to repel the enemy's rear communications. The situation was exactly the same as at Stalingrad in December 1942. And then Hitler was ready to agree with the attempt of the 6th Army to break out of the encirclement to meet the 4th Panzer Army, approaching with the purpose of deblockade. But at the same time he demanded to hold Stalingrad at the same time, which meant that the 6th Army was unable to release forces to break out of the encirclement. When I once again reported by telephone to General Zeitzler about the absolute impracticability of Hitler's demand, he replied that Hitler did not understand the seriousness of the situation. It is true that late in the evening a summons was received, according to which I was ordered to report to the Führer's headquarters the next day. In addition to discussing this issue with the General Command, I considered it in those days, and with the commander of the 1st Panzer Army. Colonel General Hube was in agreement with the Army Group Command that the situation created in the 1st Panzer Army could not continue. He also considered it necessary to save it from the threat of encirclement. However, he did not want to break through with the army to the west and proposed to withdraw it to the south behind the Dniester. It was certainly the easier route at this point. To the west it would have to break through 2 tank armies of the enemy, and to the south it could go at this time still without serious fighting. Nevertheless, I could not agree with this opinion of Colonel General Hube. First, it was necessary that the 1st Tank Army, moving westward, joined with the 4th Tank Army. How else could the enemy's breakthrough into Galicia north of the Carpathians be prevented? An attempt by the army to slip southward across the Dniester would have ended at best with it being pushed back into the Carpathians, but even that is doubtful. Certainly the route south across the Dniester was initially less risky. However, a more detailed analysis showed that it was leading the army to its doom. It had no crossing facilities and no bridges to traverse the Dniester on a wide front. If it attempted to cross the river on the few permanent bridges, it would lose the bulk of its heavy equipment to enemy air action. But even more importantly, the enemy was on the offensive from the east already south of the Dniester. Sooner or later the army would have found itself between these advancing enemy forces and his 2 tank armies, which had just cut its communications and were going to force the Dniester in the rear of the army in a southerly direction. Therefore I left no doubt in General Hube's mind that the Army Group Command would not allow the army to retreat to the southern bank of the Dniester, but would order a breakthrough in a westerly direction. Even before my flight to Obersalzberg, the 1st Tank Army received a tentative order, breaking through to the west, to first restore communication with the German grouping in the area of the Zeebrugge River. It was to try on its part, making this strike, to cut off the rear of the enemy tank army advancing on Kamenets-Podolsky. Flying out of Lvov in the early morning of March 25th, I arrived at Berghof in time for the afternoon situation report. I characterized to Hitler the situation of the 1st Panzer Army, pointing out that the enemy is a strong pressure on the eastern and northern sections of its front, which for a long time is not able to withstand exhausted divisions, given the same insufficient supply, carried out by air. Deep on the western flank of the army, the enemy is on its communications. Advanced units of one tank army already on the southern bank of the Dniester, the other tank army to the southeast, Kamenets-Podolsky, aimed at the rear of the 1st Tank Army. The enemy is also on the offensive south of the Dniester to block the army's way across the river. In such a situation, I noted, there is nothing else to do but to break through the army's tank formations to the west to restore their rear communications and communication with the 4th Tank Army. Thus, perhaps, it would be possible to immediately cut off the rear of both enemy armies operating in the rear of the 1st Tank Army. The army would have to cover its movement to the west with part of its forces from the east and from the northeast. Where the cover should be organized is a minor question. Be that as it may, the army could by no means keep the positions of its currently overstretched eastern and northeastern fronts stationary. True, with its southern flank it must still adjoin the Dniester. I reported that in no case could I agree with General Hube's plan to withdraw the army to the southern bank of the Dniester, first of all because of the operational necessity to concentrate the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies north of the Carpathians, but also because the retreat of the army to the southern bank of the Dniester would lead it there, in all probability, to a new encirclement and then destruction. Finally, I added that the condition for the success of my proposed breakthrough of the army to the west was a counterattack by the 4th Panzer Army. For this purpose, the 4th Army should be immediately allocated reinforcements. To this, Hitler stated that he did not have the opportunity to allocate forces for this purpose. As long as he has to reckon with the likelihood of invasion in the west, he cannot remove from there a single compound. The stay of our divisions in Hungary, he also called it absolutely necessary for political reasons. Further, Hitler did not want to recognize that the inevitable consequence of the breakthrough of the 1st Panzer Army to the west should be a corresponding transfer of the front line facing east. There was a sharp argument between Hitler and me, during which he tried to blame me for the unfavorable development of events on the front of the army group. A few days earlier, General Zeitzler had told me that Hitler had once expressed that the army group headquarters was unwise in spending the forces allocated to it. I asked Zeitzler to tell Hitler on my behalf that army group headquarters had no choice but to use the divisions allocated to us individually, since we received them at our disposal only individually, usually too late. If Hitler had ever, even after a long interval of time, promised us the considerable forces which we had all along demanded for the northern flank, or had given us a free hand on the southern flank, he would not now have had to complain that the forces allocated to us piecemeal were insufficient. General Zeitzler was quite in agreement with me. Indeed, this was a decisive circumstance for the entire course of the Operation Citadel. Now Hitler argued that we wanted to always give combat operations only maneuver character in the fall. He was told that the Dnieper would be held. But they said that he, Hitler, had barely given his heartfelt consent to a retreat beyond this river, as already stated that we must retreat further, as there was a breakthrough near Kiev. I replied that this was the way it was to turn out. On his instructions, the forces of our southern flank were given the task of holding the Donbass and later the Dnieper region, while we could use them to reinforce our northern flank. Hitler then began to argue that, according to air reconnaissance, only individual enemy tanks had been marked, from which entire German army units were fleeing, and because of this, the front line was continuously being drawn back. Since Hitler air reconnaissance reports received only from the Air Force Command, I admit that here Göring again showed his hatred of ground forces. I objected rather sharply that if the troops can no longer hold in certain areas, it is due to their excessive fatigue, attrition and reduction in numbers. Army Group Command has often enough pointed out that with such overstretched fronts and such a condition of the troops must come a moment when the forces of the troops will be exhausted. That the command of the group can by no means be accused of leniency is proved by the fact that we have made the replacement of a number of mid-level commanders. All of them, I pointed out, are tried and brave troop commanders who, however, were unable to counteract the weakening spirit of resistance in their troops. The fact that both newly formed divisions, included in the 4th Tank Army, were defeated by enemy tank formations numbering 200 vehicles due to their lack of training and lack of combat experience. About this we also reported quite often. Since this conversation could not lead to anything, I finally stated that I dare to believe that there is unanimity of opinion that the 1st Tank Army, concentrating its tank forces, should break through to the west first to restore communication with the 4th Tank Army second, and to regain their rear communications. Further, other forces must cover this operation from the north and east. Where this will prove possible, the situation will show, I continued. But the order to the 1st Tank Army I must give today. I repeated that success can only be expected if the 4th Panzer Army will be able to strike from the west to meet the 1 Tank Army. However, Hitler again rejected this demand. A secondary discussion was scheduled for the evening report of the situation. Despite the divergence of our opinions, Hitler and this time retained an appropriate tone. Coming out of that familiar large hall with a beautiful view of Salzburg, in which the reports were made, I asked to call the Führer's adjutant, General Schmundt. I asked him to report to Hitler that I consider it inexpedient for me to further command the army group. Unless Hitler agrees to accept my proposals, I ask him to entrust the command of the group to someone else, if Hitler finds it impossible to support my point of view and the proposed measures. After lunch, my Chief of Staff, General Bussy, called me at my apartment. Colonel General Hube persistently suggested not to break through to the west, but to retreat southward beyond the Dniester. In the evening a radiogram came from the army, which again indicated that a breakthrough to the west was not feasible, and a breakthrough to the south was a necessity. Already to the first proposal General Busse answered negatively, but asked for my final decision. My decision remained the same: the army must break through to the west. When I appeared for the evening report of the situation, Hitler's mood changed radically. He began with the following words: I have thought it over again. I agree with your plan regarding the breakthrough of the 1st Panzer Army to the west. I also decided to include in your proposed strike group 4 Panzer Army newly formed in the west of the SS Panzer Corps, in the composition of 9 and 10 SS TDSS, as well as 100 HSD from Hungary and 367 PD. I reported that during this time I rejected the new proposal of General Hube to break through to the south and insisted on the breakthrough of the army to the west. In my opinion, I continued, the breakthrough to the west will be successful, as both enemy tank armies are likely to disperse their forces in the direction of crossing the Dnieper. Then, accompanying me, Chief of Operations, Lieutenant Colonel Schultz Butcher, read my order to the 1st Tank Army for a breakthrough to the west. Using Hitler's unexpected concession, I expressed some more thoughts on the further conduct of hostilities. The task of Army Group South should be to create a stable front in the area between the Carpathians and the Pripyat marshes. The Army Group Command instructed to concentrate the 1st Hungarian Army north of the Carpathians in the area of Stryai, where it should defend the mountainous terrain between the mountain range and the upper Dniester. The 8th Army, I continued, must now be included in Army Group A, to which falls the defence of the borders of Romania. First, we have to accept the existence of a gap between the two groups of armies. This gap should be covered in the area of the Carpathian passes by forces still in Hungary. I have made a proposal to create a unified command for the entire southern wing, including the Allied armies. Perhaps it would be appropriate, given the task to carry out the defence of the borders of Romania, to appoint a Commander Marshal Antonescu, giving him the status of German Chief of Staff. However, Hitler did not want to discuss the matter. He said only that the Marshal, for political reasons, would reject such a proposal. At the end of the discussion of the situation, which, in contrast to the day's report, was held in an atmosphere of complete harmony, Hitler went into the reception room to see if the table is set for us. With great satisfaction he read to me a report of the Turkish press, which said that Germany long ago it was time to intervene in the affairs of Hungary. The situation there was much more ripe for this than could be supposed. On the morning of March 26th, I flew back to the Army Group. The 8th Army moved during this time in the subordination of Army Group A. The next day I arrived at the headquarters of the 4th Panzer Army to discuss the question of carrying out a strike, which the army, together with the new forces promised to her by Hitler to carry out to meet the 1 Tank Army. General Pey was confident that he would be able to re-establish communication with the 1st Panzer Army, although he expressed fears for the section of the front he held. Ternopil, declared a fortress by Hitler, was surrounded. The same threat loomed over the 13th Artillery Corps on the left flank of the armies in the Brody area. However, here it was possible to avoid encirclement. In any case, after Hitler on March 25 during the discussion of the situation conceded to our demands, the Army Group headquarters could confidently expect that the release of the 1st Panzer Army, and thus the concentration of it, and the 4th Panzer Army north of the Carpathians will be crowned with success. However, it turned out that although the success achieved during the discussion on March 25, and will allow to retain one tank army, but Hitler, after the forced concession, obviously became in the burden of cooperation with me. The same applied to Field Marshal von Kleist. He appeared in Obersalzberg 2 days later, to finally achieve the withdrawal of his army group on the lower Dniester. On the morning of March 30th, I was awakened by the unexpected news that Hitler's plane Condor, which had already taken on board Field Marshal von Kleist at his headquarters, was soon to land in Lemberg. This airplane was to take me along with von Kleist to Obersalzberg. While I, together with my Chief of Operations Schultz Butcher and my Adjutant Stahlberg, was waiting at the Lvov airfield for the landing of the Condor, my Chief of Staff was talking to General Zeitzler. The latter reported which, however, we were already clear that Hitler wants to remove both von Kleist and me from our posts. Upon arrival in Berchtesgaden, we first spoke with General Zeitzler, as Hitler wanted to receive us only before the evening report of the situation. Zeitzler reported that since our last meetings in Obersalzberg, Göring and Himmler, and probably also Keitel, had again launched attacks, especially against me. According to Zeitzler, this contributed to Hitler's decision to part with Kleist and me. When Hitler informed Zeitzler of his intention, he immediately demanded his dismissal, since he had always been in full agreement with me and could not stay if I left. But Hitler rudely refused his request, which was then repeated in writing as well. This honest and open behavior of the Chief of the General Staff was worthy of high praise. I will allow myself to take the description of this, my last meeting with Hitler, from a diary entry I made the next day, in the evening at the Führer's. After the presentation of swords, he told me that he decided to transfer command of the army group to another general. In the East has passed the time of operations on a large scale, for which I was particularly suited. Here it is now important to simply hold positions tenaciously. The beginning of this new method of commanding troops must be associated with a new name and a new motto. Hence the change of command of the army group, the name of which he also intends to change. He, Hitler, wants to strongly emphasize that between us in no way there is no atmosphere of mistrust, as has previously occurred in the cases of other field marshals. He, Hitler, still has full confidence in me. He also never found any shortcomings in the management of the army group, moreover, was in complete agreement with the command of the group. But it is also clear to him, Hitler continued, that for a year and a half the army group command carried too heavy a burden of responsibility, and therefore rest seems well deserved. He knows that I am one of his most capable commanders, so he soon wants to use me again. But at this time there are no tasks for me in the East. For what is to be done there now, the most suitable to him seemed Model, who stopped the retreat of Army Group North, which took place in a difficult situation. Once again assuring me of his full confidence, the Führer also told me that he would never forget that before the campaign in the West, I was the only one who told him that the breakthrough at Sedan could and should have meant not only one battle won, but also had a decisive influence on the course of the entire campaign in the West. I replied to the Führer that I could certainly not object to anything, because he considered it possible under the circumstances to solve the tasks more successfully working with another commander, and therefore wanted to make an appropriate replacement. I also believe that I can transfer command to Model without significant damage to the case, because I added, already taken decisive measures to save the 1st Panzer Army first, his decision to transfer from the West SS Tank Corps, and second, my order to the army to break through to the west-north of the Dniester, thus done what should mainly do at present the command of the army group. In the future it will only be important that the command organizes assistance and moral support for the troops. The Model will also cope with this. The Führer vividly agreed that Model would be a particularly suitable person for this. He will be carried in all divisions and squeeze the last out of the troops. To this I replied that the divisions of the army group under my command have long since given the last, and the other will not be able to squeeze out of them nothing more. However much one may regard in isolation what Hitler said to me during this our last meeting, it should be noted that he still chose a decent form to say goodbye to me. The reason for this was not in the least due to Zeitzler's demand. If, he said, Hitler wants to remove Field Marshal von Kleist and me, then at least let him himself inform us of this and the reasons that prompted him to do so. I knew that Göring and Himmler had long sought my removal. And yet Hitler's decision was apparently significantly influenced by the fact that he had to concede to me on March 25th, after he had previously, in the presence of a number of persons, rejected my proposals. When Hitler shook my hand in farewell, I said, "I wish you, my Führer, that your decision today will not prove to be wrong." Then, in a similar manner, Hitler announced his decision to Field Marshal von Kleist. When we left Berghof, in front of the door already stood our successors made in Field Marshals Colonel General Model, who was to take command of Army Group South, renamed Army Group South, renamed Army Group Northern Ukraine, and General Schörner, who replaced Kleist. The next morning I flew back to Lemberg. My successor was delayed in Krakow by a snowstorm. Therefore I had the opportunity, giving April 1st, the front order for the Army Group, to ensure the interaction of our two tank armies during the beginning of the breakthrough operation. That same day in the afternoon, I visited the 4th Tank Army to discuss with the Army Commander the use of the newly arriving SS Tank Corps and to bid him farewell. With the commanders of the other armies under my command, I was only able to bid farewell in writing. On the evening of April 2nd, I handed over command to my successor. The liberation of the 1st Tank Army and the concentration of both armies in the area between the Carpathians and the Pripyat marshes, which was crucial to the overall situation, could be considered a matter secured, although there were still some heavy battles to be fought. In accordance with the operation plan, the 4th Tank Army went on the offensive to the east on April 5th. By April 9th, the 1st Tank Army was liberated. I still had to say goodbye to my headquarters, separation from my comrades in arms who together with me had lived through the times of battles and victories in the Crimea, the hard winter campaign of 1942/43, and its, after all, still successful completion, and then numerous difficulties of the campaign of 1943 to 1944, was difficult not only for me. I was pleased to see how deep the mutual trust between us had become over the years, how sincere was the pain that our cooperation had come to an end. I could say the same of the commanders of the armies that were subordinate to me. On my staff, my dismissal from my post was like a stroke of thunder. When I returned to Lemberg, I found my comrades completely confused. My closest comrades at work, the Chief of Staff, the Chief of Staff Operations, the Chief of Logistics, and the Chief of Officer Personnel requested that they be utilized elsewhere. The Office of Personnel Management granted their requests. Only General Bussi was to remain in his position for some time to ensure that continuity of leadership was maintained. As for me personally, my removal from command meant that I was relieved of a responsibility that was becoming increasingly difficult to bear under the circumstances. This burden of responsibility consisted not so much in the extremely high demands placed on the troops and commanders by the uninterrupted 9-month struggle with the enemy, who had an overwhelming superiority in strength. In this struggle, we always found a way out of a difficult situation, whether it was a question of stopping the enemy's advance or of striking him in defense, as a result of which he was deprived of the opportunity to gain, it seemed, a very close victory. All this is described here only in general terms. Within the limits of this description, it is impossible to convey the feats accomplished by the German soldier as they deserve. The constant struggle which we had to wage with the High Command, even on absolutely necessary questions of combat operations, made the burden especially heavy on my closest aides, on me, and not in the least on the commanders of the armies which formed part of our group. The demands which we had again and again made and defended for the concentration of the main effort in the decisive section of the campaign, and for the right of free manoeuvre, were at the same time only external, situation-driven signs of the struggle. In principle, it was a question of the insurmountable difference between the strategic and correspondingly operational concept. Hitler's conception, explained by the properties of his character and views, which I have characterized in the chapter Hitler as Supreme Commander. The concept of command of the army group, based on the traditional principles and views of the German General Staff. On the one hand, the point of view of a dictator who believed in the power of his will, with the help of which he thought it possible not only to firmly pin his armies where they stood, but also to make the enemy stop a dictator who was afraid of the risk. At the same time, not excluding the possibility of losing prestige, a man who, for all his talent, still has not mastered the basics of the true skill of a commander. On the other hand, the point of view of military leaders who, by their upbringing and military education, firmly adhered to the view that the conduct of war is an art, the essential elements of which are a clear assessment of the situation and courage of decision, the success of which should be sought only in the maneuvering conduct of hostilities, as only under this condition can be fully realized superiority of the German command and troops. It is true that justice demands the recognition that the conduct of hostilities, as it appeared to the Army Group Command, would have required Hitler to take great risks in other theatres of war and on other parts of the Eastern Front, and would have forced him to accept heavy losses in the political and military economic fields. Nevertheless, this would have been perhaps the only way to accomplish as early as 1943 the depletion of the Soviet strike force, and thus open the way to achieving a draw in the political field in the East. If the Army Group Command's struggle for a different conduct of hostilities was generally unsuccessful, if its confidence that it could cope with the enemy was therefore not translated into reality, one thing was still achieved. The enemy was unable to encircle the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front, which allowed him to do the operational situation and its multiple superiority. It is true that we had to cede to the enemy vast areas, and at the same time the strength of our troops continued to decline, but we prevented the enemy to make a decisive step towards victory. Army Group South, although bleeding with thousands of wounds, maintained its fighting ability. For me and my comrades in work, it was the greatest satisfaction that in this unequal struggle against a vastly superior enemy, as well as against the High Command, which did not want to recognize what could already be foreseen, we were still able to prevent the troops subordinate to us from suffering once again the fate of Stalingrad. At Cherkassy, as well as in the case of the 1st Tank Army, we were able to wrest from the hands of the enemy the spoils, which he considered already surely his. It was difficult for me to transfer command only because from that moment on I was no longer able to help the troops, who had always trusted their command. On April 3rd, 1944, I left our headquarters in Lemberg. All my faithful comrades in arms gathered at the train station to say goodbye. When the train was already moving, the last words to me were heard. They were shouted by my pilot, Oberleutnant Langer. How often in the most difficult weather conditions he had confidently piloted the airplane with me on board. Now he asked to join the fighter aviation, in the ranks of which he was soon destined to die a pilot's death. I took his words as a final message of loyalty from my comrades. Here they are. Mr. Field Marshal, we removed today from the car the Crimean shield, our sign of victory.